Welcome to episode 287 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Chris Tarbell, who served in the FBI for 10 years. In this episode, he reviews his investigation and the takedown of the cryptocurrency-based drug underground marketplace, Silk Road, and the arrest of its founder. The investigation, codename Operation Onion Peeler, resulted in the largest seizure of Bitcoins to date. During Chris Tarbell's career, he specialized in cyber investigations and incident response. Initially, he was hired as a computer analysis response team, or CART, forensic examiner stationed in Quantico, where he responded to investigations all over the world supporting matters related to terrorism, botnets, and other cyber crimes. Later, the FBI appointed him as a special agent and assigned him to the FBI's cybercrime squad in New York City. Besides the takedown of Silk Road, Chris was also the lead investigator on several of the FBI's most complex and cutting-edge cybercrime cases, including the investigation and arrest of the leader of Anonymous and the LulzSec hacking crews. Chris has been qualified in federal court as an expert witness in computer forensics, providing expert testimony in multiple federal criminal trials. Currently, Chris is the co-founder of Nexo, a cybersecurity investigations firm focused on cryptocurrency, digital forensics, and cyber defense. Composed of former FBI special agents, computer scientists, and forensic experts, the company provides proactive and reactive services to law enforcement, legal teams, and growing companies. You can listen to Hacker and the Fed, the podcast Chris co-hosts with his former subject, Hector Monsegar, now a top network penetration tester and security engineer. On the weekly show, they discuss cybersecurity news. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll find links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee, join my reader team about crime fiction, and learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, former agent Chris Tarbell. Hey, Chris, how are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, this is pretty exciting. I actually have done a lot of research, like I always try to do, to learn a little bit about the case that we're going to be talking about. I just want to know, in case you leave something out or there's something that I had a question about, I can ask you about that. You've been talking about this case, and it's been fascinating just listening and really kind of learning more about the dark web and why these type of cases are important and the significance for our world today that you have these secret dealings going on the internet. So yeah, I'm really thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks. No, I'm excited about telling the stories. I've been silent for a lot of years about the story, but recently I've come out and started talking about it. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and why is that? Because I was thinking this case went down almost, 8 years ago?
No, we're talking almost 9 now. This June will be 9 years.
What made you decide to start talking about this now?
There's a whole bunch of stuff. For a long time, they wanted me to let it go through court. This case was pretty famous. Ross was convicted for a large amount of time and has appealed his case to the Supreme Court, which he's exhausted that route to get out of jail. He's only left with the presidential pardon. And the less we could put out there, the better. The prosecutor just didn't want me talking about things. And I didn't really feel a need to talk about things. Everyone had their own opinions and the internet gets mad about things. So I just let it stand. There was no reason for me to go out and tell my story.
I always like to say there's always a reason to tell the story. One of the many reasons that I like to stress is not only does it contribute to the positive public perception of the FBI, it also preserves institutional knowledge so that agents who are listening, people in law enforcement are listening, can learn from your investigation and get an idea of the different ways that you can investigate cybercrime. I'm thrilled that you're here today. This case is about illegal activity that takes place on the dark web. I guess we should start by defining for everyone what the dark web is.
That term has been thrown around a lot. And I think when Silk Road was first taken down, that's when you see like the iceberg on the cover of Time magazine and things like that. And people try to explain it. I still don't think the concept's out there. There's the deep web and then there's the dark web. The deep web, I like to explain, it's kind of anywhere Google can't go. Some of your listeners might be surprised that they go to the deep web. They'd be like, no, I never go to the deep web. But like your bank account is in part of the deep web. It's password protected. It's behind a barrier that Google can't go and find things. And that's the way you kind of want it. But then there's the dark web. The dark web is where illegal activity happens. And people talk about Tor or the Onion router, as it's called, as being the dark web. But there can be dark web places on the regular internet. There was recently a place called Breach Forums that the FBI just took down that posted breached, stolen information off the internet. That was on the regular internet. There's credit card sellers that are on the regular internet. That's part of the dark web. Traditionally, what the media has picked up on is this Tor or the Onion router, these hidden websites that you need specialized software to go to, as being the dark web. Dark web's just places where illegal things happen on the internet.
Well, that was enlightening. I think we all have a better understanding of the difference between the deep web and the dark web now. Where do you want to start?
I really have to go back to kind of the very beginning. It was a case we did called Anonymous, and it was a hacking group online. And we arrested a guy named Hector Montsegur, went by the name Sabu at the time. I like to describe him as the Kaiser Sose of hacking in this time period. Everybody was looking for him. Well, we ended up arresting Hector and we flipped him and used him as a source. This was kind of strange for the FBI at the time because this was the top level guy. Normally in the FBI, we'd arrest a low level guy and work our way up like an organized crime case. But now we had the top guy. So we decided, what can we do with the top level guy? Let's learn what's happening in the hacking world. Let's sit down with this top guy and have him teach us really what's going on in the community. And that's what we did for 8 months. Part of that 8 months, there was a guy named Chaos, who had come into the anonymous world and was starting to break into law enforcement agencies, police agencies, spreading like information that we just didn't want out there. It became the number one cyber target at the time, but he was hiding himself behind this thing called Tor, the Onion router. Eventually, through enough communications, we were able to figure out that Chaos was a guy named Jeremy Hammond in Chicago, and we were able to arrest him. But we had this Tor thing that was always coming up. We started looking at more and more case files, and you'd work a case. In cybercrime, you always trace two different things. You trace the money and you trace the IP addresses. We'd send out a subpoena for the IP addresses, or we'd look up what the IP address belonged to, and it kept all coming up to Tor, case closed. Another case comes along, Tor IP, case closed. We were like, this seems very strange. What is this Tor thing, and what can we do about it? My partner and me at the time, this guy named Milan Patel in the New York office, we opened up a case called the Onion Peeler. This was 26 websites on the onions on the Tor network. They don't have .com URLs. They have .onions. You need a specialized software called the Tor browser to access these onion sites. But these were websites out there that offered hacking tools that we had gone around and found there's 26 different sites. And so we were going to open a case to try to target these hacking sites because we were on a hacking squad. We were on CY2 in New York. The SAC at the time told us, find all the sites possible that sell either hacking services or hacking tools, and you can open a case on it. One of those sites, I think it was number 6 in our case, was Silk Road. We knew at the time that Silk Road was the golden ring of Tor sites. One, because it was mentioned on the floor of Congress. A senator had mentioned that this was a dark market website that sold anything and needed to be taken down. We knew it had publicity. It had been in Wired magazine. The owner had done an interview in there. So this was the golden ring that we were going to go for. We were looking at all 26, but we knew this was the one.
You said that the owner of Silk Road did an interview in Wired magazine.
Yes.
And now you know who he is.
Well, we knew that the owner went by the name of DPR, Dread Pirate Roberts. He did an interview anonymously under that name.
Okay.
So we didn't know who the owner was. We just knew it was a guy who publicly called himself DPR.
What's the deal with all of these strange and weird names, nicknames and secret names?
Oh, that's how the internet works. You're a real person, but online you can be a different persona. You can be almost anybody who you want to be. I mentioned that we arrested Hector Montsegur as Sabu. Hector, he's a sweet guy. He's a fun-loving guy, just a sweet guy. Sabu, he's ruthless. Two different people, an online persona and the real person. Does not have to be the same thing. I think we'll kind of discover that too as we walk down Silk Road about DPR.
Was this Silk Road investigation one of the first where you were able to successfully take down somebody working on the dark web?
I believe it was the first investigation from beginning to end of a dark web market where we had all the successes of taking down the market, arresting the bad guy, confiscating the cryptocurrency or the payment methodology. So yeah, it was the first of its kind. There's been many since then. I think there's going to be many more in the future because these dark market websites just keep popping up. But yeah, it was the tip of the spear on dark market websites.
All right. And one last comment. What a great name for the case, Onion Peeler. Whose idea was that? Was that yours?
I'm not really sure. I will say that it would be surprising to people that aren't in the FBI, your listeners, of how much time is spent picking out a case name. We kind of understand, and we worked with Southern District on this case. They understand what it's going to be to go out there and do it. Another case we worked on, we spent probably more time than you'd expect and more resources went into the naming of the case. Seeing that we knew that the U.S. attorney was going to mention it on the news, Onion Peeler, I don't want to get to the end of the story, but knowing that the publicity that would come down if we were to take down Silk Road, the president could have mentioned it. The AG could have mentioned it, but we'll tell that part at the end of the story. I can't take credit. It was either me, Chris Stangl, or Milan Patel that came up with it. And Chris Stangl was our supervisor on the squad at the time.
Again, great name. So where were you?
We opened this case because we started seeing all these cases about Tor, and they were stopping what was happening in the Bureau as far as investigations. So we wanted to see what we could get into. We just got on the sites and we started looking around and monitoring what was going on. It was a traditional cyber investigation, just looking to see what could happen and what intelligence we could glean, what was being sold on the sites. Silk Road, the way it operated was sort of like an eBay online. You could buy nearly anything you wanted to do on Silk Road. You could buy heroin straight from Afghanistan. You could buy hacking services. You could buy hacking tools. You could buy anything, like I said. The two things you couldn't buy, for a short time you could, the first one is guns. They didn't want to let you buy guns there because, well, to be honest with you, there was just another site and they didn't want the traffic to mix over between the guns and the drugs. The second thing you couldn't buy were fake degrees. You couldn't buy like a doctorate or an MD degree. Dread Pirate Roberts didn't want you to have the ability to fake that sort of thing. Which, thinking in hindsight of who he is, it's because he worked very hard to get an advanced degree, I would assume. So he didn't want someone to cheat their way to that sort of ability. Silk Road, again, you could buy fake IDs, just not fake doctorate degrees or fake advanced degrees. You could buy drugs. You could buy nearly anything.
What about sex trafficking? We're always concerned about that. And of course, child exploitation images.
You probably could. You could probably find someone contact. That wasn't a big thing on Silk Road, not for a long period of time. There's plenty of other channels that were on Tor and still are on Tor that need to be taken down for that sort of thing, for either selling pictures and even going as far as renting children. There are some dark market sites that do that. Traditionally, we're just taking a look at this case. We're moving around. We found a guy at Quantico who I had worked with before in the anonymous case, a guy named Matt Edmond. And he was working in the Tor space and kind of looking around there. So he kind of joined the team. And by this time, Milan Patel had moved on to headquarters and he wasn't interacting with the case too much, but we were still friends. So I was kind of running with the ball on my own here on Silk Road. We sort of got lucky and through some techniques. Well, first, I'm getting ahead of myself. We opened this case and we're kind of going along. Come to find out there was another investigation in Baltimore that was looking into Silk Road. And that was a task force put together with Homeland Security, Secret Service, DEA, pretty much every law enforcement except for the FBI. They were trying to do the traditional way of working their way up the chain, arresting someone who got a package delivered to their house. And that's the one way that the drugs were delivered from Silk Road. You would order them online. Silk Road would keep an escrow of your payment, and then the drug dealer would send drugs to your house. And when you were satisfied with the sale, the money would then move to the drug dealer. Silk Road would keep their 10% cut of each transaction. This was all done through Bitcoin, cryptocurrency. Like I mentioned earlier in cybercrime, that we trace two different things. We trace IP addresses and we trace money. Well, Silk Road had now defeated both of those. They were using Tor to defeat IP addresses, and they were using cryptocurrency to be able to trace money. Nowadays, we hear about blockchain and going through the blockchain and figuring out. Back then, we didn't have any way of doing this. There weren't any tools that we could use to trace Bitcoin or anything. We were on our own. So that's another reason we paired up with this guy, Matt Edmond, down in Quantico to help with our case. He worked down there at the lab. So we're moving our case along. With the help of Matt and a little bit of luck, we were able to find that the Silk Road Onion was running in Iceland and that it was communicating back and forth with other servers in Iceland and it was doing its sort of thing. So the prosecutor, Sarah Turner, and I hopped on a plane and flew over to Iceland and met with the Icelandic police and the Icelandic prosecution and explained what Silk Road was and the bad things it was doing and that they should open a parallel investigation through the MLAT process and that sort of thing. They were able to open their own investigation. About a week later, they went out and they looked at the server and they found out the server was running RAID 0, meaning that it had two different hard drives. Two copies of the hard drive were running on the same server. All we had to do was pull one of the copies out and plug a new drive in, and we had a copy of the server. It was good to go. They sent that back to us. They sent it to Sarah Turner, the prosecutor. He walked it over to my office and had to leave for a meeting. I went back into the lab and I plugged it in and I looked at it and the whole disk was encrypted. One of the things we worried about was that the operator of Silk Road had encrypted the disk and we would not be able to look at anything. We'd have to find her a new way. We found the server, but we couldn't do anything with it. We could shut down the service, but that's a whack-a-mole approach.
Because he could just get a new server and start all over again.
Exactly. And we would know nothing about it because the payment information in Iceland was done through Bitcoin. We couldn't even trace it to a person.
Were you worried about the person, the people, the organization that were administrating the server would go back to your subject and let them know that you were there?
Were we worried about the people in Iceland tipping off? No, not at all. We knew that the people in Iceland were legitimate and that they wouldn't even know that law enforcement was there. On the administrative side of the server, all it looked like is like a hard drive failed. And the people that run the service just swapped out the hard drive and put a new one in. So because they were configured the server in a way running RAID 0, that kind of saved us. We didn't have to shut down the server in order to get a copy of it or anything. It's a protection. So if one disk fails, the service doesn't shut down. It's redundancy. But also in that configuration allowed us to grab a copy without them understanding what we were doing. I was saving grace.
Yeah, I'm still kind of confused. And again, because I'm not computer or cyber literate, that the people, and I don't even know what you would call them, but who service the server. The server is actually a physical machine, equipment. Is that correct?
Correct. It was a computer running in Iceland in a big data center with thousands of servers in it.
Okay. And the Silk Road contracted with them to let them operate Silk Road through that server.
Well, when you contract with an ISP, you just buy a server. You don't tell them what you're running on it. They don't care what you're running on it. I want to rent this server at a monthly cost, and I'm going to use this much bandwidth, and I'll pay this much for the bandwidth. Giant data services in Iceland, and Iceland's very popular for running servers for two reasons. One, the power is really cheap because it's all geothermic. And also the cooling. Computers need cool temperatures, and Iceland's got a lot of free cooling temperature to run these servers. This data warehouse had thousands of servers in it. Inside that data warehouse, sub companies would buy big blocks of computers, and then they rented parts of those sub blocks to the Silk Road administrators, DPR at the time.
Yeah, and I hope this is helpful for people listening who are like me, just weren't quite sure how that worked. I know for my own website, I use Bluehost. I guess I understand. Bluehost doesn't know what I'm doing on my website. I just contract with them to host my website with them.
And I would guess, if we made an analogy to this case, that your Bluehost is in like an Amazon data center. Bluehost probably owns a few computers in a giant warehouse owned by Amazon, if it was a parallel to this case.
Okay. I hope that's helpful. It's helpful for me. So I hope for people listening that it was helpful for them, for me to take you on this side tangent.
The parallel would be like law enforcement going to Amazon. Amazon doesn't care who Bluehost is, and Amazon certainly doesn't care about your website. They have no idea. It's just a computer in their massive warehouse of computers. And in Iceland, law enforcement is a little bit more respected and would never, I'm not going to go against the Icelandic police and I'm not going to say something to a customer. I felt that respect from that. They wouldn't. It's always a chance. It's always a risk in cybercrime. You have to take that risk to get the evidence sometimes.
Absolutely.
We have a copy of the server. And like I said, we're starting to go through this. So it's all locked up and it's encrypted. That was my big worry. I called over to Sarah and I said, Sarah, it's encrypted. We're going to have to find a new way to move this case forward or the case is just dead. And Sarah goes, oh, the Icelandics sent me a password for it. And I was like, what? They're like, oh yeah, they encrypted it. They wanted to make sure it traveled safe to over here. No one could look at it. I was like, okay, you could have told me that when you were here. He gave me the password. I went back into the office, unlocked the computer, and Silk Road server wide open. Everything we needed, all the evidence we needed for Silk Road was right in there.
Wow.
People logging into it, IPs coming into it to administrate it, where backup copies were going of the Silk Road. We had all the chat logs of all the drugs being sold on Silk Road right there, was kept on the server. The cryptocurrency you need to spend for each transaction, the cryptocurrency wasn't there. That was on a different server, but the transaction logs for the cryptocurrency was right there. We had hit the mother lode. We had everyone's chat log, including all the chat logs that DPR had ever had on the site.
To give people an understanding of the volume of drugs and how important this was, could you equate or compare the amount of drugs being sold on the site to what's sold in Philadelphia or New York, just to give us the volume? And also, if you could tell us about the types of drugs.
I wish I could tell you volumes, but I'm not a drug guy. I never worked drug cases in my life. I'm sure you've got a lot of listeners that work drug cases and are going to say these are dime bags going back and forth. They're very small amounts. Two things. It was roughly about $1.2 billion worth of sales in the time period that it was running, which I say is substantially 90% of it, if not more, were drug sales, which I think $1 billion in drugs is a lot going back and forth for me. It was going all over the world. It isn't just a location set. The difference that they explained to me, and again, I'm not a drug guy and I don't know much about the drug sales industry and all that, is that you could get heroin straight off of a block from Afghanistan. When you get heroin on the city streets, it's been cut many times, meaning things have been added to it. So it's not as pure as what you were getting off of Silk Road. You can get literally any drug you wanted. And if it wasn't for sale on Silk Road, you could go on Silk Road and ask for it. And then sellers would come back to you and say, yeah, I get my hands on that. This is what I want for it. It was literally like a bazaar for drug sales.
They would just send it to you through the mail or some type of UPS or FedEx?
Yeah, they used our mail system to deliver it. There was instructions on how to set up either a drop location or a drop box. I don't want to give anybody a playbook on how to commit crime, but people would find a house in their neighborhood where maybe people aren't living there and use that address and then watch the package as it's being delivered. There were instructions on how to package drugs, how to hide them in certain containers, and what else to put in with the drugs in order to get past the drug dogs and that sort of thing. It was a full service shop on Silk Road for both the buyers and the sellers.
That's fascinating.
We got the server unlocked and we have it and we're in full bore now. But at the same time, we have this organization in Baltimore who's now kind of having a tantrum of that they want a copy of the server. They want to look at it. They found out that we have a copy. So we have what's called a deconfliction meeting. This was a big thing down in DC, the DOJ put on. And we were all supposed to come together and sit down and put in our cases, what we had, and what we can add to the group. I proclaimed that I was too busy and I wasn't going to go, but I joined by video conference from the New York office. We had all this data. I was being a little obtuse, but I was going through a lot of data. And like I said, my co-case had left at the time. And so I was kind of running the case myself. I just didn't have time to go down to it. And I didn't want to. These guys had been jerking us around for a while. They kept using the term sweat equity. They had put 2 years in on this case. They needed the information and really pushing for the information, which was getting kind of strange to me and why they're pushing so hard. But I guess they had thought they had put their effort in and they really wanted the data. So we sat down in the meeting, and the first guy to talk was a guy from Chicago named Jared Darriagan. He was an HSI investigator, Homeland Security investigator. And before this meeting, I had never heard of him. I had no idea who he is. He talks about that he was assigned to work out at O'Hare. A package came through a few years ago, and he had traced that package back to the website Silk Road. And so he had opened his own investigation into Silk Road and had mapped out all these players on the site and had put together all this information. It was very impressive, and he was very honest. He just laid out his case and put it out there. I kind of took note of that. And then they asked me to talk about what we found. And I said, well, we have the server. We know where the server is. We have all the chat logs from it, and everyone's jaw just kind of dropped. And Baltimore was asked to go, and they were very standoffish. They wouldn't tell us where their case was. They wouldn't tell us what was going on there. They just said, well, we have all this stuff. We know who DPR is, that sort of thing. And it was very weird. We felt pitted against them. It was strange. I just can't name it in any other way, but strange. So anyways, we just kind of left the meeting, and DOJ didn't put their fist down and say, well, you guys need to give them a server. They kind of said, let's see where this pans out. Let's see where this goes. And I think that didn't come from my presentation or anything like that. I think that came from the weight of Southern District. I was working with Southern District on this case, and they were able to kind of use their might and their influence to keep the case in Southern District.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that listeners know that you're talking about the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just say Southern, and I expect, just like the attorneys at Southern District, I expect everyone just knows what I'm talking about. Sometimes a mistake. So we have the case, and we find that the server is doing a backup into backup servers in Philadelphia. We find some other infrastructure around where it's talking back and forth. But now we have actual computer evidence where we can get a search warrant for, and that's in the United States. We go down there and get a copy of it, and it's a backup of all the different versions Silk Road has been from the very beginning, and even more extensive chat logs and copies of the chat logs and the sales and all that. Around that same time, I started getting phone calls from the case agents down in Baltimore. I was in Vermont for a weekend with my family. We were looking at leaves or going on rides or something that way. The case agents from Baltimore called me up and said, "We're coming Monday." I said, "Coming Monday for what?" Like, "We're taking a copy of the server." And we started getting sort of a pissing match. I pull over to the side of the road and I'm yelling at another federal agent on the phone. And it was just weird. I said, "Do not show up at our office. You're not going to be let in." It left it very strange for me. There's this huge tension now between us and Baltimore, the Baltimore Silk Road investigation and our investigation. So we looked in a little further what was going on in Baltimore. Apparently, those guys had started an undercover and were talking to DPR, Dread Pirate Roberts, and had found a guy that was working as an admin on the site on Silk Road. And he lived out in Utah, and they flew out to Utah. The guy admitted to it. They had faked killing him. So they reached out to DPR through their undercover operation and said that this guy had stolen from you. In order to get the money back, we have to kill him. And so DPR sanctioned the killing and paid this guy to do it, the undercover to do it. And so they faked the pictures and then sent the pictures to DPR. Lo and behold, which I didn't know of at the time, these agents from Secret Service and DEA logged into Silk Road using this guy's credentials and stole a bunch of Bitcoins, sold a bunch of cryptocurrency from DPR.
Oh, so when they were looking for your call logs, wanting that information, it's because they knew that you had evidence of what they did.
I didn't know it at the time. And like I said, it felt icky. You were an investigator. You understand when something just feels off. These guys, I understand about being competitive and wanting to take down the case that they've been working on. It just felt weird how the pressure they were putting on me. And yeah, you're right. It's because we had collected and we said on that meeting that we had a server and all the chat logs. These guys knew eventually we'd figure out that they historically had broken into Silk Road using the guy's credentials and stole a bunch of Bitcoins.
Wow.
Again, I didn't know at the time.
And again, they didn't tell you that at this deconfliction meeting that you had. How did you find out about, I guess you call it murder for hire thing that they had done with DPR? Did they eventually tell you? How did you find out about that aspect of their case?
That's a fantastic question. So that deconfliction meeting, I think, was on a Thursday. Over that weekend, I'm starting on Friday, and over that weekend, I called Jared Darriagan, the HSI guy in Chicago that had opened that case. And I said, "Man, I like what you're doing. I like what you got on. Why don't you come out and take a look at our stuff? And you and I will sit down and talk about it, what's going on, and see what we can do." He flew to New York and was there Monday morning. We sat in the back office of CY2, and I just told him everything. There's the server. We rebuilt it. You can look at it. You can look at anything you want. And he explained what he had doing in his case. Now, part of that Baltimore connection, there was an HSI part of it. And so he knew what was going on in their investigation because his boss wanted him to play well with the others. So he had to share all of his information with those guys. Well, part of that, the information came back to him, what they had going on. So it really was a partnership we now made with Jared. Jared came to New York and we started working together. Come to find out, Jared had mapped out all the second level administrators on Silk Road and was kind of working his way in there. And eventually he became an undercover administrator on Silk Road. He's helping DPR run things. He's an undercover federal agent running Silk Road, talking to DPR almost daily. But again, we didn't know who DPR was. We're still trying to run things down and figure out that. We have the server, we understand how the server works, and we have an undercover working with DPR with Jared on our team now. Still running down the facts. But let me set out, around this time, we kind of set the goals of the investigation. It was a three-pronged approach that we wanted on this one. We wanted to arrest DPR, obviously, get the guy who's running the site. We wanted to put up a splash page on the Onion address so that the world knew that, hey, these dark market websites, they're vulnerable. They can be taken down. And 3, we wanted to seize all the cryptocurrency. We wanted to make sure we had our hands on all the money, and no one took that during the case. The pieces are coming together. We got Jared on the team. A couple of new pieces of information came in at the same time. Jared was working with DPR, and DPR had set up what's called a Jabber server. It's a communication server, a private way of chatting. It's a Jabber server, and then they put it on Tor for the added security of the using Tor to protect their IPs. DPR sent Jared and the other admins instructions on how to connect to the Jabber server. And we saw through screenshots that DPR was now connected through Pacific Coast time, a clue for us that DPR himself had put himself on the West Coast of the United States, 1/24th of the world. That narrows it down for us a little bit in this investigation. We also had seen that the server in Philadelphia was being connected to by a computer through Tor, so we couldn't trace the IP address, but the name of the computer was Frosty. We had figured out based on the connections, and the DPR was doing the administration, that DPR's computer at home was named Frosty, which was a big clue to us at the time. Putting together this with a few other subpoena facts and all that, Jared and I are kind of sitting there not figuring out what things are going. Saren Turner, the prosecutor in the case, came over to the New York office and sat in the back lab. I had put together, it's not the pictures with the red string, but it was a big piece of paper with names and pictures and lines I had drawn across it. I took the Hollywood approach to doing an FBI case. And Saren saw it and looked at it, and he saw this Frosty thing. And he says, there's another guy, this guy in the IRS. He's got some information on Silk Road. Let's see if he can get on a call tonight and figure out what's going on. So I went home and I was laying in my bed. This was a long day. And we had a call about 7:30 or so that night. And it was me and Jared and Saren and the IRS agent. And the IRS agent's telling us that he found some information, that he went onto Google and went onto Google Cache, the historic information of Google, and found that the very first person who was ever announced on the internet about Silk Road was a guy who posted under the name Frosty. And he was looking for help on setting up a Tor Onion services that used Bitcoin. Well, this was our big break because we were the only people that knew any sort of connection to the name Frosty and DPR. It was us and DPR. That was it. And so this one posting on the internet way, way back at the very start of Silk Road in 2011 was out there. And he said, if you could help me create this website, reach out to me at ross.ulbricht@gmail.com. And I know what your other FBI listeners are thinking. That's a clue.
Yeah, that is a big clue.
We started looking into this guy named Ross Ulbricht. Off the radar, couldn't really find much about him, but we did find that he's in San Francisco. He's in that time zone that we knew DPR was. So we needed to do a little bit more looking into. Come to find out, some fake IDs had been purchased, were being sent to Ross Ulbricht during Silk Road. Fake IDs had come through the mail and they traced it back to a Silk Road purchase. And they went out and talked to this guy, Ross, in San Francisco, HSI agents did, about what this is. And Ross toyed with these HSI agents. He says, I don't know, but I know you can buy fake IDs like this on sites like Silk Road. That was part of the case file, but they didn't give him the IDs. But come to find out, looking through the chat logs and the timings of when he was there, Ross was buying the fake IDs so he could buy different servers, because a lot of servers at the time had switched over to, it's called KYC, or Know Your Customer. You had to provide a picture of your ID online. So he went on Silk Road under a different name, not DPR, and he had bought these fake IDs and them sent to his house.
How convenient for him that he had a store that he could purchase this.
Exactly. It was very nice. He had set this all up for him. We did some more investigation. We really keyed in on Ross, and everything we put together, we put up a pen register on his email, everything aligned to Ross being DPR. We started monitoring his internet traffic. When DPR was online, Ross was online. When DPR was off, he was off. This was it. We put together a few other electronic surveillance clues of what was going on. We got the affidavit that everyone's seen online for the arrest of Ross Ulbricht. Saren Turner and I went over to the courts at Southern District. And for the first time I've ever done it, Saren said he had never heard of it. We took the judge's private elevator up to chambers for him to read the affidavit and eventually signed off on it. And even sitting in his chambers after he signed off on it and said, you guys, when you make this arrest, it's going to be huge news. People are going to talk about this case for years. I kind of understood what he was talking about, but I would never suspect that I'd still be on a podcast 9 years later talking about it. But it was big. So it was exciting. Me, Tom Kiernan, who was my computer scientist at the time in the FBI, and Jared Dagan, another surveillance agent from New York, we all flew out to San Francisco, and we wanted to have a way of arresting Ross. We needed the laptop computer we knew was the evidence that we needed. We knew Ross was running his drug empire off of this laptop. He had talked about it with Jared in an undercover fashion, that all of the keys were on the laptop. But he also talked about heavy encryption or even possibly a degausser. A degausser was a device that if you hit a button, it destroys your hard drive. You can't get any memory on the computer. But we knew the computer evidence was pretty important to us. I mentioned earlier that we arrested a guy named Jeremy Hammond. We did that by using a SWAT team. I think it was kind of the first time we've ever used a tactical SWAT team to make a cyber arrest. And when they arrested Jeremy, the SWAT team comes in and throws flashbangs. But unfortunately, they watched Jeremy close the laptop and it was encrypted. And it took us a long time to encrypt the laptop and get that evidence off there, but we did. And Jeremy was convicted. But we knew that was a problem, possibly an issue. You kind of know that in the FBI, there's, the FBI way of doing things. Back when I was a local cop, we would have arrested our guy and gone down to the media and screamed to the world, this is our guy. We're good to go. But we knew this time we needed the laptop. We needed to come up with a plan. So when I flew out to San Francisco, I went out to the boss of the cyber division out there, the ASAC, and we sat in his office. This guy had been on probably for 20 years or so. I explained what I had and I explained why Silk Road was so bad, why we were taking it down. And at this point, not only was that other murder for hire done, there were more murders that Ross had ordered on the website that we had found in the chat log. We couldn't let Silk Road be up any longer. It was time to take it down. And so I flew out there and I sat in the ASAC's office and explained what I had and how I needed the laptop. And the ASAC sat back in his chair and he goes, all right, I know what we can do with this. We'll send in a SWAT team. We'll send it dynamic. We'll send in flashbangs. We'll get him when he's online and we'll get the laptop. And so I told him the Jeremy Hammond story and I knew that it wouldn't work. The ASAC, a lot of experience. He sits back and he spends a few more minutes thinking about it. And he finally tells me, all right, I know what we'll do. We'll go in at 5 a.m. and we'll send in 3 SWAT teams. And he had a plan where SWAT teams were going to rappel from a helicopter and come up through the basement and all that. And he just looked at me and he labeled me as a New York cowboy. I asked him for a couple days. I said, can we just do a couple days and see what's going on out there and what's happening?
Well, you have to explain to people who don't know what a cowboy is in our FBI terminology.
So a cowboy kind of comes in and just does it his own way. Won't listen to reason, won't listen to what the boss is telling him they have to do. This guy did have 4 times the amount of law enforcement experience that I did. So I should be listening to him. But the problem is he didn't live through that arrest of Chaos. So he doesn't understand how crucial it is to get that laptop while it's up and running. There's a lot of cybercrime these days, and the jury needs the fingers on the keyboard in order to convict. Who was actually on the keyboard when it was happening and what evidence is on that laptop. We needed it to stay open. A cowboy is going to just do whatever they want and get out there. And New York agents were kind of famous for that, kind of coming into the different jurisdictions and the different field offices and just kind of trying to run things the New York way. The New York way, I put in quotes, is good and bad, but it carries a stigma with it. I wasn't trying to run things and do it the cowboy way, so I was labeled.
You knew the possibilities of something being done, that laptop being encrypted or damaged in some way, and you wanted some type of an arrest that could be made where you could ensure that wouldn't happen.
Yeah, I wanted it outside of his house. I knew that a SWAT team couldn't make it through the front door and all the way to wherever Ross rented a room in this house to there before simply just closing the laptop, which would have locked it, or hitting a button if he did have the degausser. I mentioned at the beginning, the sweat equity. I had invested in this case so much, I didn't want it to be messed up here at the very end. So I asked for 2 days. I said, can we just do some surveillance and figure out what's going on? The first day of surveillance in the neighborhood, we're out in San Francisco. I'm sure a lot of your listeners understand the game that's played. There's a conference every year in Las Vegas in the hacking world called DEF CON. And DEF CON has Spot the Fed, which is funny to go around to see who the feds are the thing. They sort of play Spot the Fed in San Francisco neighbor is a little bit easier. We kind of stick out there, the untucked shirt with the bulge, the short haircut, pants that have pockets near the kneecaps, the cargo pants, dead giveaway for Fed in the San Francisco neighborhood. We were out there and we're down the street from Ross's house. Nothing. Doesn't move, doesn't do anything, nothing going on. So we go out there the second day. I think it's October 3rd is the second day. And we're in a government shutdown at this point. The government has stopped functioning. Everyone that isn't an 1811 isn't working anymore. Everything stopped. We're not being paid at this point, but we're still doing this case and moving forward.
Oh, one of those periods of time.
Yeah. So it just had stopped. Yeah, it was a budget thing, a battle between the president and the Congress at the time. The second day, we get to a cafe and we're down the block and we're just kind of sitting there. Nothing's happening. Nothing's going on. We've had a plainclothes surveillance team on Ross this entire time on his house. So we're sitting in this cafe, the 3 New York guys and Jared from Chicago, just kind of talking, having coffee, buying a coffee every couple hours, just so it looks like we're patrons and all that. And we get a call from the team leader of the surveillance team. Ross is walking out of the house and he's got a laptop bag over his shoulder. This is good news. Ross got his computer. So we scurry out of the cafe. We run. I take a left. I come in the crosswalk, and there's Ross face to face. I got his arrest warrant in my pocket. This is DPR. We've been searching him for 9 months. The other team had been searching for him for 2 years. This is our guy. I'd love to have thrown him to the ground and arrested him right there. Safe and sound. We had him. Everything's good to go. But I made the call. The laptop was too important. So I walked right past him, which was very strange for me. Circled back around, made my way, squared the block, and I came around and I sat in a bench across the street from the cafe. Ross went into the cafe we were just in and noticed that it was kind of crowded there and didn't want to sit in there anymore. So he goes next door and went to a public library. The library, as you open the door, has stairs that goes upstairs. He went upstairs and sat in the science fiction section in a window that we could see from the outside. Whether he sat there strategically so he could see outside, I don't know. But he sat there in the window and opened his laptop at a table. We saw him sitting there. Jared came over and he sat next to me on this bench across the street and he opened up his laptop. He logged in as the undercover administrator and started chatting with DPR. So now we're looking in the window, and every time Jared talks to DPR, we see Ross Ulbricht in the window typing on his computer. We had connected that gap between the real person, Ross Ulbricht, and DPR, the online persona.
You personally were sure that they were the same person, or was that another validation for you?
I swore out the affidavit against him, the 47-page affidavit against him. I was sure of all the facts in the affidavit that said DPR was Ross. In cybercrime, there's always that little, oh man, what if? Because it's not like you're catching someone on camera robbing a bank or doing something like that. You still have to connect that persona. There's never 100%, but watching him in the window sure helped. Just watching him type when DPR was typing was a helpful clue at the whole thing. So I gave the arrest execution. I sent out a message to the entire team. Let Ross run. That's fine. We need the laptop. It's more important. This was about 2:30 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, our entire team was due down in San Jose for the briefing for the SWAT team arrest that was going to happen the next morning at Ross's house. Unbeknownst to them that we weren't even going to make that meeting. The surveillance team, the plainclothes surveillance guys, these guys are great at the job. You would never know they're FBI agents. There was a female agent who says she's 5 feet tall, and I'll say she's 5 feet tall, but there's no way she's 5 feet tall. Wearing a baseball cap and plainclothes, sits at the table across from Ross as he runs his billion-dollar drug empire on his laptop, reading a magazine. And then an older male agent and a female agent, they walk into the library and walk up behind Ross, and the female agent says, F you, really loud, too loud for a library, and hauls back and punches the male agent right in the jaw. It was pretty cool. Ross turns around to see what's happening behind him, and the 5 feet tall female agent at the table takes the laptop and pulls it across the table. And then one of the New York guys I brought, Todd, he puts his hands on Ross' shoulder and put him under arrest, and then walked him out to me where I put him in cuffs and patted him down.
Sounds like a scene from a movie.
They have made a movie about it. It worked out perfectly that we were able to get the laptop and safely arrest Ross on a public place. And then I had to call that ASAC and let him know that we had just made the arrest. And he called us again in front of the group that was waiting for us down in San Jose, a bunch of effing New York cowboys. I think I was labeled that permanently.
It was kind of a cowboy move.
It was, but no one understood that I needed that laptop. I couldn't get across how much I needed that laptop open for the case to be a slam dunk.
And this was perfect. I would take it, and we can talk about this as you move us through. There's always, after an arrest, you have an arrest plan, and then after an arrest, they kind of go through the arrest. I would take it that was going to be an uncomfortable review of the arrest for you.
That part never really happened, thank God.
Really?
The next day, I was in court for Ross's initial appearance. We were on the cover of every major U.S. newspaper, the case. That afternoon, I hopped on a plane and hauled ass out of there as fast as I could. I got back to New York. Now, I will say my ASAC, Austin Berglis, he probably caught a bunch of flack for that. But he was willing to stand up, take that heat for us.
Well, I'm sure the fact that it made the cover of all of these newspapers and media outlets part of the fact that you weren't chastised because, in a different situation and a different outcome, I'm sure there were many reasons that they would have been upset that an arrest went down in a public library.
Yeah, the safety aspect never really came across to me on that one. In my mindset, I was a cowboy at the time and going forward through it. But to me, it was the only way to make the arrest and make it in a good way that collected the evidence that we needed. It all worked out in the end. But yeah, I guess I wouldn't suggest that to any new agents. They never had me to Quantico to teach that tactic. I'll tell you that.
This is really fascinating because you're looking at this case and the different methods that you use to investigate it and to do the arrest and kind of comparing it, at least I am comparing it to, as you mentioned before, a drug squad, because this guy is basically a drug kingpin. The people in Baltimore and even the HHI guy in Chicago were trying to do it the traditional way of going up from getting some of the drug crew on the corner and working their way up to the big guy. But you understood that this was the type of investigation that couldn't be worked that way.
I didn't know it couldn't be worked that way. I kind of understood it couldn't be worked that way, but my approach was a cyber approach. I was a cyber agent. That's what I was trained in. That's what I had my experience in. So I said, well, if these guys are looking into this drug way, I don't know drugs, so let them handle that way. I'll see if we can do it from this cyber approach. Just a different way of looking at the same thing and taking a different approach at it. After the arrest, Tom Kiernan was able to keep the laptop alive and get all the pictures and all that. I mentioned that we were under a government shutdown because the plan of attack was for the attorney general and the president to announce the arrest. Because, God forbid, you can't appear that the government is working during a government shutdown. The only thing that ever went public, and it was on the newspaper the next day, was my name and that affidavit that I had signed with all the details. That's sort of why normally a case agent, it doesn't get the notoriety for the big cases. But in this case, if you want to say the stars aligned, I don't know if I measure it that same way, but the publicity fell on me on that one. Good and bad. We can get to the reason. One of the reasons I left the Bureau was from the bad publicity of this. But because we were able to do it, we recovered 177,000 Bitcoins from Silk Road and Ross's computer. Ross was sentenced, well, he was charged with, you bring up Kingpin. He got Kingpin status and was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 40 years,
Wow.
which is more than El Chapo got for being a drug dealer.
Wow. I take it that's the reason for all of the appeals that you talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, I didn't follow the cases exactly, but yeah, the judge really kind of hammered home on this one. I think part of it was trying to stop people from doing this in the future because we got lucky in this one, but these sites could be set up again and the government might not have the resources to be able to find it.
So what is happening now? I understand that they continue to have these type of sites on the dark web, that they are selling drugs and sex trafficking and child porn and things like that.
At the time, I would have guessed that cryptocurrency would have failed because people would have said, oh, yeah, this is just what's being used for criminals to transfer money. Well, you can see based on the last 9 years, cryptocurrency has not failed. Everyone knows about it. And then the dark web and the stuff that you can buy on there, I kind of feel like the publicity made it more popular. More sites popped up after this. More people took that risk. And I just don't understand. If the operator of the first one got 2 life sentences plus 40 years, people are still willing to take that risk. It's something I've never understood.
Can we go back a little bit and talk more about what happened in Baltimore with the DEA agent and the Secret Service agent and how you found out about that and if you had anything to do with that investigation, either as part of the investigative team or providing testimony?
Sure. Like I said, I had that icky feeling of what was going on with these guys. It was more than just sweat equity, but I didn't look into it. I think at one point, Jared told me what some of the undercover names they were using, but we ended up turning over a copy of the server to San Francisco, and they ran with that investigation, and they ended up charging both the DEA agent and the Secret Service agent with crimes. The DEA agent is out. I think the Secret Service guy is still in jail. The one got 6 years and one got 8 or 9 years for what they did through stealing and trying to steal funds from the government and steal funds from Ross. A lot of people ask the question of why didn't we ever charge Ross with the murders for hire? I think it was a lot of because of that, the dirtiness of the investigation in Baltimore. He's already got 2 life sentences plus 40 years. Do we really need to spend the effort into another trial? People ask me a lot whether there were no bodies and there were no real murders. They were just tricks. Yes, I agree that there are no bodies that ended up in this. But one thing we found, because we arrested Ross in the way we did, we found a diary on his computer. He kept his own internal monologue or his feelings of going on. And part of that included the murders and how he felt about paying for people to be murdered and ordering people to be murdered. People think that, oh, there's no bodies, he didn't do anything wrong. He thought he was. He really was tricked into believing that he did commit those 6 murders.
It was just fortunate that he made these transactions for this murder for hire with undercover feds. He could have actually found somebody online that was not an undercover law enforcement officer who would have been more than willing to do it. So it doesn't make a difference that it didn't actually happen, that they set it up and staged that they had committed these murders. He wanted it done. He paid for it to be done. And that's a crime.
Yeah, and you can see Ross's mental transformation. He started this site, he grew his own mushrooms and opened this site and sold those mushrooms, and then it grew into Silk Road to being it. And then the first murder, which was the one through the undercovers, he's very oh, I don't know about this. He stole from me, but I don't know. To the last murders were not through an undercover, but another guy who was just tricking him. And he said, this guy that you want killed lives with 3 guys. We can't get your money back unless we kill all of them. So Ross was very nonchalant. Well, just kill them all then. You saw the evolution of his mindset into what I would consider would be a drug czar.
Wow, that really is amazing, and something for everyone to think about when they kind of minimize this and say it's something that's online. There's really no difference, especially when money, lots and lots of money becomes involved. Greed will make you do a lot of things that you never thought you would.
Yeah, and you bring up the internet. It's interesting that people feel a little bit more confident to do things on the internet. They have what they call e-muscles. They flex their e-muscles. The things that people will say to each other on social media, on Twitter and that sort of thing, you would never have the oomph to say that to someone in person.
Don't we know that? Once you make that arrest, once you put the handcuffs on someone, that is not the end of it. Now it's a matter of pulling together all those months and years of investigation and evidence and assisting the U.S. Attorney's Office in trying this guy, to prosecuting this person. My understanding is that you left before that point, and I'm very curious as to why.
There was a lot of things. When I joined, the FBI was always a dream of mine. I never thought I was smart enough or good enough to join the FBI. And when I did, I thought that was my career. That was going to be it. A lot of things added up at the end. After we arrested Ross, the other thing we wanted to do was to arrest all the other administrators on Silk Road. There was a guy just south of Richmond, Virginia, down there. Another guy we found in Ireland and another guy in Australia. Lucky for me, as the case agent, I got to pick. I sent a guy from the squad to go to Australia. He loved it, but I didn't want to be on a plane for 26 hours. I sent another guy to Ireland, and I took the guy down in Virginia. Just one of those weird bureau experiences that, they have rules about BU cars and not abusing BU cars. I was driving from New York down to Richmond to make the arrest, and I had stopped at FBI cyber headquarters. Milan Patel, the guy who opened the case with me, he was down there. I wanted to see him, a couple old friends that were now bosses at cyber headquarters. So a slight deviation from my path, maybe a few miles off the highway. Well, I got called on the carpet of that by my ASAC. It was somewhat of I could be in trouble, but he was going to maybe try to stop me from getting into trouble because of that. I never realized that deviating off my path to go to FBI headquarters was a punishable offense. That sort of got me upset. And I was just I just gave up a major case to the FBI and you're going to do this to me. And then also on top of that, like I said, we took $1.2 billion. Well, that was all of Silk Road, but we took, at the time, it was $200 or $300 million in crypto from out of the escrow account for Silk Road. So we stole money from a lot of drug dealers. There was another dark web website that put a bounty on the lives of me and my family. Doing the Silk Road case, my wife knew what I was working on, but had no idea how large it was. They put this hit out on us. I got to lock down my kid's school. NYPD was great to help us with that. And then lights and sirens to the school and get them out. And we moved into a safe house for a while. The New York office was really good about putting us up in a safe place. And then headquarters came in and made my neighborhood very safe. You couldn't drive into my neighborhood without a license plate being read or that sort of thing. I just remember my mother-in-law looking at me and be like, I thought you did cybercrime. How the hell did this happen? So I had to answer that question. And then on top of that, the notoriety got out there. I started getting very good job offers out in the private sector. And so it kind of all came to a head. And then finally, I put in for a 6-month ALAT position down in Australia. I was like, I just did this case. It got a lot of publicity. It got going very far. I just need sort of a break. It timed out just perfectly where I'd be down there for like 2 months. Then my family could come for 3 months for the summer. And then the last month, it would be a great not have to look at casework for a few minutes. And it wasn't even signed off or allowed to leave the New York office for me to put in for it. All those sort of issues kind of came to a head. And I was like, I'm going to take the job. I sat with my wife. We prayed about it and talked about it. And it just came to the answer that maybe the Bureau wasn't the best move for us in our future. I'm very happy that I left, but I missed the hell out of it.
All right, we're going to have to go back a little bit and tell me more about these threats. Again,
Okay.
I understand that the reason that you were threatened is because when you took this Bitcoin out of escrow, people had already paid for Silk Road to buy drugs, sell drugs, and so you took their money. And
Yes.
so I can understand them being upset. How did you find out about the threat, and how was the threat communicated to you or to the FBI?
I was sitting at my desk one morning. So I'm a routine guy. I sit to a routine. I left the house about 4:30. I go to the gym. I'm always at my desk by 7:00. And then I was sitting at my desk having a cup of coffee, talking to the squad mates. And I got a call at 8 from Jared in Chicago. And he says, hey, check out this Onion site. We got issues. I logged into it and it said my name. It said my 2 kids' names and it had a price for killing them next to it. Now, a lot of people have talked about these websites and say they're bullshit and their murder for hire sites aren't real and all that. When you see your name and your kids' names with a price next to their head, you don't think about that sort of thing. You don't think whether it's bullshit or not. You just feel the threat. And I just stood up. My supervisor at the time understood the panic in my eye, and a squad mate threw me in a car and we drove as fast as we could while I was on the phone with my kid's school locking it down.
That gave me chills just listening to that. Yeah, I get it. I absolutely get it. And you're right. You were mentioning before that normally when you have a case, when it's announced, the SAC or in New York's situation, the ADIC and all the other people, the U.S. attorney, they're at the press conference and the name of the case agents are never mentioned. Of course, the reporters can see who signed off on who is the affiant on different search warrants, but usually the connection directly to the case agent is not there.
Every other case I've worked, you're not even on stage when they announce it. You're in the back of the audience behind the media.
If you're even there, because usually
Exactly.
you're doing that work I talked about, preparing for the next stage of the investigation, the prosecution.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a confluence of situations. Just like I said, stars align. I don't know, but I probably wouldn't have got those nice offers in the public sector without it. But also, my kids wouldn't have been subject to that sort of thing.
Yeah. So you got that offer that you couldn't refuse.
Yeah, maybe if a few of the other things, like I would have never even taken the offer if like the Australia thing came through. To work in the Bureau and be like the ALAT down in Australia, that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. As everybody listening knows, I was just in Australia. It would be a cool place to work.
Yeah. I'll never say that the Bureau owed me anything, but I felt like I just needed a quick break. And I understand probably, they're thinking, oh, you can put the trial together and all that. But at this point, I literally arrested Ross with his fingers on the keyboard. I would have never expected it to go to trial. He took it to trial, not to blow the story on the trial, but the jury took 3 hours to come up with their verdict, and they took a lunch within that 3 hours.
So I can understand why you never thought it would go to that stage. You would have assumed that he would have tried to get a plea deal.
We had all the logs. We had copies of all the servers. We had his computer wide open, logged in as mastermind. He was logged into the Silk Road server when we arrested him.
I've heard your story a number of times, especially spending most of my career in the Philadelphia office, and I don't understand. It's not the Bureau, the institution who does that. But for some reason, when you have a case agent who's made unbelievable sacrifice of their time, just dedicated themselves to a case, you would think that you'd want to celebrate her or him and kind of show them how much you appreciate the work they've done by allowing them different, not perks, but things that they've shown they deserved, like a nice assignment. It is kind of sad that really the attitude is, okay, what have you done for me lately?
I've heard like old school Bureau was like, did a big case, maybe got to know your family for a few weeks, maybe a month. You're out shagging leads, or as they say. Yeah, I didn't have that experience. It was like, what's the next thing?
Well, that's sad. And again, it doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, in your situation, you feel like, why would you do this when you have now an experienced person, especially when it comes to cybercrime, when we are desperate to find and recruit people to come in? It's a sad situation, but I certainly understand why you decided to take that opportunity.
A lot of the cases I worked led me to Iceland. I was in Iceland like 3 or 4 times with the Bureau.
That's on my
And
bucket list.
oh, you have to go. It's the most beautiful place. If you ever want to see how the earth was born, this is it. They have so many waterfalls because the water hasn't cut through the rock yet. We have the Grand Canyon because it's been there for so long. This is fresh earth. I remember standing in a place where the North American and the European continents are dividing apart. And I was like, man, if I could ever one day bring my family here. And those private sector offers came along and I was like, well, now I can take my family. And so that's what we did. The first thing I did outside the viewer is went to Iceland with Tom Kiernan and his family, the computer scientist on my squad. And we drove around Iceland for a week. It was fantastic.
It's definitely going to happen. I don't know when, but I will get there. So we know why you ended up leaving the Bureau, but I have a standard question I love to ask all my guests because we always get a different response. And that is when and why you joined the FBI.
I joined the FBI on my birthday of 2005, the most exciting day of my life. I joined as a non-agent first. I was a professional support employee. I went to headquarters. I was put on a forensic team. I was on a CART team out of Quantico. I worked out of headquarters, and it was a great experience. Talk about traveling the world and seeing cases. Before that, I was a local cop, and I got a master's degree in computer science. I wanted to use my computer skills a little bit more in law enforcement, and so I applied for this CART position. At the time, I didn't think I was qualified to be a special agent, so I wanted to join the Bureau in any way I could and get that experience so I could become an agent. That's the path I took. The FBI was always a dream of mine.
I know there are going to be people who have a cyber background who are interested in joining the FBI, who are going to be curious as to why you didn't think you qualified at the time, because my understanding is that they're looking for people and they're trying to get them early into the Bureau as agents because of the fact that if they don't, by the time that they are quote unquote experienced, they're at that level of opportunity that the Bureau, where they would have to take a pay cut if they came into the Bureau. Talk about the skills that you had at the time and why you thought that you weren't ready for the agent position and what you think now about that.
I was just naive and stupid. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Like, I put FBI special agent, I still will to this day, up on a pedestal that was unattainable from this, I was a kid who with decent grades in high school, decent grades in college. I just thought it was an unattainable goal for myself. I don't have a low self-esteem or anything like that. I just thought it's an FBI special agent. That's insane to me. It's even insane to me once in a while. Like to this day, I will get a phone call and I'll hang up the phone and be like, oh my God, I was just talking to an FBI agent. That is so cool. And then I'm like, you were an FBI agent. I still can't comprehend it. I just thought I had a master's degree in computer science and a couple of years experience as law enforcement. I didn't even want to apply. I wanted to join the Bureau. But again, getting in early. I was 26 when I got in. I turned 27th on my first day. I would have loved to have just gone to agent school from the very beginning. But my experience in CART was fantastic. It really has built a lot of skills that I used in my investigative time. And I got to experience, I probably visited at least 30 to 35 different field offices before I was even an agent. Orders night on week 6, where it wasn't so scary for me because I had been to most of the field offices.
You stayed for 10 years?
Yep, I was just slightly under 10 years.
And then you left. Are you still at that great opportunity, that great job? Or have you moved on to bigger, even bigger and better things since then?
It's been a couple jobs since then, but now I own my own cybersecurity firm, and we are still doing a lot of work with the government and federal law enforcement. It's a company called Naxo. We help them solve technical solutions that they need assistance with. Just like I needed help on Silk Road, we're able to help them get across some technical bounds that they might need.
I will put a link to Nexo, your company, in the show notes for this episode.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You also have a podcast.
I do, yes. I started a podcast called Hacker in the Fed, and my co-host I have both arrested and worked with many times. I've arrested him twice. Hector Montsegur, a.k.a. Sabu from Anonymous.
Yeah, you mentioned him during the episode. Well, that sounds fascinating. I haven't had a chance to listen to it, but I'm sure the origin story of how you came together and decided to do the podcast is one of your first episodes. And so we'll all have an opportunity to listen to that because I will also put a link to your podcast in the show notes for this episode.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
What I'd like to do is give my guest the last word. And of course, you can choose whatever you want to say, but I certainly would love to hear also, because we can make this as long as you want, but I certainly would love to hear also about what you think the threat of cybercrime is as the internet and social media and all of these things that are done online, especially when mentioned that people are braver and more out there when they're online than they would be in real life. What would you like to say?
First, I'd like to thank you for having me on the show and the opportunity to share my story. I appreciate that. Cybercrime or cyber threats or cyber security, whatever you want to measure it, really is different for different folks. It's different for individuals. It's different for parents. It's different for companies. We all have to realize that we have the potential to be the victim of a cybercrime. If you don't think that your information is important enough to protect, you're wrong. People are trying to use your computers to steal your information, to steal your contacts, to use your computer as a hot point, meaning that they break into your computer and then do bad things from your computer. So when the FBI tries to find them, they just get to you. Really be cognizant of the threat that the online world possesses to you, and don't be nervous about it. We can help you with it. Listen to the experts and do things like change your passwords and two-factor authentication. It's not as scary as it seems. And anybody in the audience that is still in the FBI or part of the FBI, please feel free to reach out. Love talking to other FBI guys and classmates and that sort of thing. Thank you again, Jerry, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a direct link to the show notes where you'll find a photo of Chris Tarbell, along with links to articles about this case and photos of the Silk Road logo and the message authorities posted on the site after the shutdown. There's also a link to other FBI case reviews featuring cybercrime. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.